Vamos.
On est bon.
Okay. Okay, I would like to welcome everybody. I'm just waiting a few minutes, having people joining us. Okay, because, you know, there are people getting in slowly. Okay, while you are joining, I would like to welcome you all. It seems now that everybody is with us. Okay, so I think we can start. I would like to welcome you to this second plenary session of ERSA 2023. This is the session sponsored by Papers in Regional Science. I am extremely proud, honored, and very happy to have with us Julie le Gallo. Julie le Gallo, he is one of the editors of the journals, is her second terms, and we are working together and we know each other since a while, let's say like that. I am also very proud to have Julie because I think he is one of the most prominent first-class scientists in regional science, in particular in spatial econometrics. I would just spend a few words about her career because I think everybody knows her. So she is currently professor in Institut Agro-Dijon, CESAER de Dijon, Université de Bourgogne-Franche-Comté. She previously got her PhD over there, and then she had some affiliations in different universities, Bordeaux and Dijon, and then now in this last institute. She's editors in several. She's in the editorial board of several journals, and she's also fellow of the Spatial Econometric Associations, and I would say her publications span in different main, from of course the main research topic, which is spatial econometric and spatial economics, regional science, but recently she had also publication in ecological economics, GIBO, Journal of Behavioral Organization. I would say she's really a first-class professor. We are extremely happy to have her here today, just for the organizations of the sessions. I mean, to make it a little bit lively. So we decided that she prepared the presentation of about 1 hour. During the presentation, she will make some stops, and at that moment, you can put forward some questions in the chat. And then at the end of the session, because the idea is our slot is 1 hour and a half, so the presentation is more or less 1 hour. And then the last half an hour is devoted to question and discussion from the public. At that point, people that would like to address questions, please raise your hands, and the assistant that I would like to thank for the technical assistant will give you the possibility to make your question by your microphone. In that way, the interaction will be a little bit more lively and real, and I think it will be definitely better. Said that, I think that everybody is in. If you have any question, problems during the talk, you can contact me, and in the private chat, and I will, let you know which are the way of functioning. So to me, it's the time to give the floor to Julie, and thanks, Julie, for accepting to be with us today. And we are really eager to learn about your lectures. So thank you, Julie.
Thank you, Rosella, for this nice word of presentation. So first, I'm going to share the screen. It worked before, so hopefully it works now.
Yes, we see it. Perfect.
Good. So thank you, Rosella, and thank you for the organizers of ERSA for inviting me to make this keynote speak. So it's a great honor for me to be there and to talk to you about short-term rentals, which are, these short-term accommodation platforms, which have been investigated a lot in tourism economics. And here I would like to point out some issues that should be of interest for regional and urban scientists. So speaking about spatial patterns and their economic impact. So what are sharing platforms? So it's part of what has been called the sharing economy. So this system where consumers share in the creation, the production, the distribution, the trade, and the consumption of goods and services. So they are leveraged by information technology, the internet. So these sharing platforms, here you have a set of examples related to different topics in transport, in accommodation, food, travel, planning activities. So surely you have used at least one of those. And you can think of these sharing platforms as triangular organizations where you have producers and consumers, and sometimes you play both the role of producers and consumers, and the platform is here as a third party that intervenes as a price into the price fixation and how the participants are managed in the platforms, and they are paid by the commission. So we have seen a very strong development of these sharing platforms since the 2010s in most countries, and thanks of course to internet and to several algorithms that match the producers and consumers with more or less transparent algorithms. In this talk, we talk mainly about sharing platforms in the context of accommodation. And in particular, I will mainly refer to Airbnb, mainly because it's the best known and most used worldwide. So you have more than 6 million houses, apartments and rooms for rent. It's active in almost all countries of the world. And you have the three countries with the largest activity are United States, France, and China. Maybe you're not completely aware of the history of Airbnb. So the legend says that it began as the form of 3 air mattresses that were put on the floor of a San Francisco apartment. So you had a major conference that was held in town at the moment, and 2 university graduates used the website to advertise their apartment as an air bed and breakfast for the attendants that wanted to avoid the high hotel prices. And then they thought they had some business ideas, so they turned this website into a service that allows everybody, other people to advertise their space. And so this is how it began. And now Airbnb describes itself as a trusted community marketplace for people to list, discover, and book unique accommodations around the world. So you have probably already seen how Airbnb website looks like. So it's straightforward. It looks like a traditional accommodation booking website. So you look for your destination, your travel date, your party size, and then the website returns a list of available spaces that match what you asked for, and you can refine by attributes like price, neighborhood, and the set of amenities. And then if you want to have more details on the listing, you can click on it. And then if you want to have more information or to book a place, then you have to have an Airbnb profile, and then everything goes through the platform that charges a fee if you make the payment. So here I made a search on the main offers in Alicante during the time of the conference. So I leave the locals to decide whether the prices that are here are competitive with respect to hotel prices. An important characteristic of Airbnb and more generally sharing platforms is that it has been presented and thought of as a disruptive innovation. So this really refers to the theory of a disruptive product that transforms the market or creates a new one. So typically you have a disruptive product. In the beginning, it underperforms with regard to the prevailing product's attributes, but it also offers a set of distinct benefits, such as being simpler, cheaper, more convenient. So you really have a product that is geared towards the low end of the market, and then it grows in size, it grows in profitability, and it appeals to a higher number of consumers, and eventually it attracts, it takes a very large share of the market, up to the point sometimes of ending the previous players in this market. And this is really what Airbnb's story that I recalled looks like. It started as something very simple, and now it's pretty much everywhere in the world. It has a great appeal to tourists in terms of cost and experience, and it has been described as being a really disruptive activity to the traditional accommodation sector, and and a significant impact on the destinations. So just a few descriptive stats. Airbnb's worldwide listings have grown exponentially since it began in 2007. It has marked some pause during the COVID pandemic. And you have a set of papers that look at how these sharing platforms on accommodation have reacted during the COVID-19 pandemic with respect to the traditional touristic accommodations, the hotels. An important characteristic is that contrary to Airbnb's narrative of, you just share some bed in a guest room, now most Airbnb hosts share entire homes, not rooms. And this is really a feature that is everywhere, and that is a characteristic of the current offer in Airbnb. So that's an important that has, of course, an important role in the urban fabric and the supply of housing. Another issue that is important is that there are a lot of, there are significant shares of Airbnb listings that are proposed by multi-hosts, that is, hosts that propose multiple homes for rent. So this goes with what has been called the professionalization of Airbnb, which also has an impact, of course, in the supply of housing. In terms of the distribution of Airbnb, well, you pretty much have it, as I was saying, everywhere in the world. So, of course, in mostly Occidental countries, but also a lot of touristic countries. And you have the same kind of pattern that arises when you zoom in Europe, where you have Airbnb, of course, in the capitals and major economic areas, but also in the most touristic areas. France has the highest Airbnb density in the world, and this goes, of course, with the fact that France is a very touristic country. So Airbnb and more generally accommodation sharing platforms has been on the forefront of public policies for some years now, because it has been really a disruptive impact on some cities and territories. It's not only in touristic and major agglomerations that you can find Airbnb. So here you have a map that shows all the places where you can find Airbnb. So of course you can find here the major agglomerations and the touristic places, but also everywhere else. And in fact, I'm going to show you some figures later where you have almost all municipalities in France that have at least one Airbnb listing in each month for the period since we have data. So it's really a major and global economic issue. It's not only a matter of city centers, as it was maybe in the beginning, but now it's not. In France also, in Paris, you have multi listings, meaning that you have Airbnb hosts that have multiple listings. So it's of course an issue. To set out a little bit the debates, what are the pros and cons of accommodation sharing platforms? So the advocates would say that it really plays the role of an additional income for homeowners, and that it allows the tourists to find accommodations that fit their budget. And also an important part of the Airbnb narrative is that it provides an authentic experience. So you live more like a local, you interact with your host and neighbors. And indeed, it extends the number of rooms that is available, and in during events or even mega events, and we already see that for next year Olympic Games in Paris. It can be important as to manage high temporary demand when the hotel supply is not enough. In some spaces, in particular in rural spaces, it can play the role of being able to spread the tourism. So in France, you have this Association of Rural Mayors of France that make an agreement with Airbnb to develop tourist accommodations in rural France where you don't have that many hotels. And then, of course, if it creates or it increases tourism, then it can be linked to increased job creation linked to tourism spending. But of course, there are also cons. And the opponents would state, and these are some arguments that I will come back later, it can be an unfair competition with the hotel industry because they are not subject to the same norms, to the same regulations than hotels. So that can be an unfair competition. And indeed, what we see is that in most places, it's not complementary to hotels, but it really adds up to an existing touristic offer. So it can be an unfair competition. It has been also pointed that it increases rents and housing prices in places where you have high Airbnb density, and this is linked to lower supply of housing because, of course, short-term and long-term markets are not completely segmented. A homeowner can make a trade-off between putting its place for rent to a short-term platform or to the traditional long-term market. And so, of course, if many homeowners choose to put their homes on these sharing platforms, then there is less supply for the traditional rental market and increased rents. And also through a set of mechanisms linked to demand, then it can also raise higher prices. Then higher rents and higher prices, traditionally this yields to gentrification. Locals have to pay higher rents, may even be displaced. And you also have that kind of issues with commercial activities that change, that do not serve the local people anymore, but that are towards tourists. So you have transformation of whole areas, and that's an issue, of course, in how in the urban fabric, and lots of complaints from the locals, as you can see here. If it increases tourism, that it can even yield to over-tourism. So there are papers that look at the effect of these accommodation platforms of increasing tourism and to generate all kinds of negative externalities, such as congestion of local public goods, of touristic amenities, also noise, pollution, and all that. And for the cities where you don't have necessarily the apparatus for collecting taxes, then it can also be a loss of tax revenues. But in fact, what I wanted to point out in this talk is that this opposition is in fact symptomatic of very spatially heterogeneous interests. Because short-term rental activity is characterized by very strong spatial heterogeneity. So of course, it is likely to produce very highly differentiated spatial effects depending on the characteristics of each territory. So, and this is of course where regional science comes into play, because we have this spatial lens into everything. So, and this is the lens I would want to have in this talk. In terms of the kind of topics and journals where these issues about short-term rentals have been published, so there's a recent meta-analysis that has been published by Ding et al. So you see a lot of tourism journals, but you also can find, it's not exhaustive, but there are also some papers that are in regional science journals and urban economics journals. In terms of the topics that are investigated, interestingly, at the beginning where you know, these sharing platform things began, you had a lot of papers on the business model, because it was a very different business model as the traditional touristic accommodation. But so the share of paper on business model has decreased, and now the share of papers that look at the impacts on housing prices and rents, so that's in gray here, or the impact on urban tourism. So these are papers that take a lot of attention. In terms of the kind of topics that you can look at, of course, you can look at the motivation of guests. Why and how do guests choose Airbnb? What are their experience, and do they remain loyal? You can also look at the motivation of hosts. What are their motivations, their experiences? And as we know, everything capitalizes into pricing, into prices. So you have these papers that look also at the determinants of short-term rental prices. Then you can look at the spatial patterns of Airbnb supply and its impact on destinations and the tourism sector. And of course, all this calls for regulation. Okay. And this is pretty much the kind of talk that I wanted to share with you. First, we can look at the spatial patterns. Where are these short-term rental listings located in space, both within but also in the whole territory of a national space, and what are the spatial determinants of Airbnb pricing? And then I'll make at least one zoom and the other, maybe if I'm not too long, on Paris. And then the second part of the talk will more deal with the economic impact. Once we know where it is located, what are the impacts of these short-term rentals on the economy, and in particular the housing and the tourism impact. And then I'm going to share also some original research for the case of France. And then I'll share with you some personal views on what could be a research agenda on this issue of short-term rentals for regional and urban scientists. And of course, as a disclaimer, I'm going to cite some papers, but what I'm going to say is absolutely not intended to be an exhaustive literature review. It's going to be a very partial and biased literature review, because of course I have this background of quantitative economist, so there are lots of papers that I've not read on the topic, and And so don't be so I've seen that then in the program of ERSA there are many sessions on tourism and over tourism. They're called like that. So that's quite interesting. And I've seen one session about short-term rental. So don't be mad if you're not cited. It's not an exhaustive literature review. And last thing in this introduction, of course, in research, we are standing on the shoulders of giants, but we're also relying on co-authors because pretty much it's a teamwork. So some of the work I'm going to present has been done in the context of various research projects. And thank you to Marie Breuiller, Yacine Alam, Kassou Mayouba, Camille Griveaux, and Yuan Ling for all the productive research that has been done on this topic. So first, looking at some issues about spatial patterns. So here you have a map of one of the few papers that have looked at Airbnb at a large scale. So here in Spain, that might be of interest for some of you. If you look at that kind of literature, you can see that there is an exhaustive, extensive literature on the locational patterns of short-term rentals, mostly focusing on one city or several cities, and you look at the within urban areas spatial distribution of Airbnb rentals or short-term rentals. Only some papers are at the level of a country or at the level of a region. I've put some of them here. What these papers show is that the majority of Airbnb rentals are located in city centers or close to transportation hubs. So here I'm going to illustrate with some figures I found in papers trying to cover a lot of cities. So here you have the example of Berlin, where indeed you find that mostly short-term rentals are located centrally. Here you have the case of Barcelona, but also some papers would tend to say that some Airbnb listings go beyond city centers and extend to areas that are previously uncovered by hotels. For instance, here in this paper by on London, where you had this initial, because it's from 2016, but this initial view that you could find Airbnb much more places than hotels in London. And also in China, this paper that shows that Airbnb listings, contrary to hotels, follows also the location of shopping malls. Okay. And lastly, an example in Andorra, where it shows that, in fact, Airbnb listings with respect to official accommodations go beyond and are a little bit farther away than to the access to ski resorts, for instance. There are some differences in the location patterns according to the type of room. So there are several papers that look at the differences in terms of location, depending on whether it's a shared room, private room, or an entire house. So this is for Toronto, and this is for Rome, where basically what happens in these papers is that the type of housing that is offered mostly depends on the overall spatial distribution of the characteristic of housing in the urban area. So here you have more shared rooms in the city center and more entire apartments in the outskirts, which is not very surprising. You also have differences according to the type of hosts. For instance, here in Brussels, what they show is that investors and professionals would tend to concentrate their offer in the city center or along the most touristic areas or close to the European institutions, whereas occasional hosts can be located more in the outskirts. Some original results that we have done in the context of France. So what we wanted is to have some large-scale view on the spatial supply and spatial determinants of Airbnb supply. And we look at that at the municipality level throughout metropolitan France. And we wanted to see how this differentiates according to the type of municipality, whether it's a city center or whether it's in a ring of an urban pole, or whether it's located in an urban area. Do we have different spatial dynamics? And also, do we have different evolutions throughout the various episodes of the COVID-19 crisis? And we make this distinction between, because we've seen in the literature that it's important to make this distinction between single room and entire housing and professional versus non-professional. In France, the criterion, the official criterion for distinguishing between professional and non-professional, professionals are those who put more than 2 housing to rent in a year, or that put housing more than 120 days per year. So that's the official criteria to distinguish between those. The data that we have come from RDNA. So it's basically a firm that scraps data from Airbnb and also HomeAway, but we excluded those because it's very marginal share. We have this long time period, long in the sense that it covers all of the COVID-19 pandemic, so from 2016 to 2022. For all municipalities in France. So one characteristic of France is that we have almost 35 municipalities. So lots of heterogeneity. As econometricians, we are very happy. Of course, in political in a political context, it can be quite complicated to manage, but for the data we can have, it's quite interesting. The variables that we have are the number of listings, so that's to capture the overall supply, and also the characteristics of supply in terms of the occupation rate and the average daily rate. We make this distinction between single room, entire apartment, and professional versus non-professional. We match that with several socioeconomic data that we gather from the national office, French national office. The spatial differentiation that we use is the zoning in aire d'attraction des villes. So basically, we distinguish between urban poles of several sizes. So we have Paris, we have urban poles of more than 700,000 inhabitants or more, etc. In each urban pole, we are able to look at what is the center, what is the urban pole, what is the ring surrounding the urban pole, and we also have municipalities that are outside attractions of these urban poles. We also gather data to capture the touristic characteristic of each municipalities, and also its accessibility with respect to Paris, to the nearest amenities, etc. If you want to have more details, I can send the paper. And we also match that with the various COVID waves. So maybe that's bad memories for some of us, or most of us. So here in the graph here, we have the evolution of the restriction measures that were introduced by the French government. So we had several lockdowns. We had 3 lockdowns in France, then easing. We also had curfews, and at the end we had health pass and vaccine pass. And since Since February 2022, we entered in a new phase, which has been called the new normal phase, meaning that COVID is still there, but we don't take any specific restriction measures with respect to that. So here you have the list of restrictive measures that were taken. So this allows us to construct some time dummies, and we also have some health data. So in terms of descriptive stats, what do we see in this large-scale study in France is that the data here, we have the total number of listings. We really see that in France, as in everywhere else, but particularly in France, because it's a very touristic place, we have an explosion of this Airbnb phenomena between January and July. With 2019, with also a lot of seasonality, of course, in the supply, with most listings that are proposed during summer. Then the activity had this growing trend, and then had a stop because of the pandemic. But we see that during the last period, so typically in summer 2022, we had even more activity, Airbnb activity. The slowdown due to COVID-19 crisis is much more marked when we consider the evolution over a sliding year. So here we really see the decrease of Airbnb listings during the first stages of the pandemic. And this decrease and then some form of catching up is even more apparent if we look at the evolution of the average occupancy rate and the evolution even more of the average daily rate. Here you had a very large catching up effect during 2021. If we look at the distribution of the share of the number of listings according to the type of housing, so whether it's a shared room or a full housing. So in France, as everywhere else now, there is the highest share is for renting full houses with respect to shared rooms. And this was even more the case during the COVID pandemic, where we had a decrease of activities for shared rooms, because you know, the users, from the demand side, the users wanted to avoid the risk of being catching of COVID-19, so the risk of virus transmission. So they would prefer to have a full housing rather than a shared rooms. But it was even the case before the pandemic crisis that the share of private rooms was decreasing. With respect to professional versus non-professional, well, it's more or less half and half. And the same patterns of seasonality. It's a little bit more seasonal for non-professionals, because typically you have non-professionals, meaning that you have a particular household that would put, for instance, its principal housing for rent during summer, when the household is on vacation elsewhere. Whereas for professional renters, those that have multiple listings or those that rent for a long time per year, then it may be more costly because you have to pay specific taxes and so on. So it may be more costly to put off the listings out of the market, so you have a little bit less seasonality. So you really have this distinction, and we will see that also in the regression results, this distinction between some kind of quantity adjustment versus price adjustment between the two types of renters. The number of municipalities with at least one listing per month over the periods, now it concerns almost all municipalities in France. Of course, not everywhere. mostly where you have this small spot in Paris, and also in littorals and in the most touristic areas. It also you can also see some differences in terms of the evolution depending on the type of municipality you have. You have a lot of seasonality in city centers or in main poles, and much less seasonality, for instance, in the municipalities that are outside all outside attractions of cities, where basically you have the same amount of listings that are offered during the year. Maybe before I switch to the econometrics, I can take one question. I see one. I just see. No, it was just to say that there is a chat to interact. Okay. So maybe I'll stop. I'll finish with this empirical presentation, and then I'll make a pause for questions if you have some. In terms of looking at the determinants of this spatial supply, so we see a lot of spatial heterogeneity in the supply. And how did we look at that? We estimated a nested model design. So basically what this term means is that we have both fixed and random terms. So the fixed effects are here. So we have a general trend for all municipalities. We have monthly dummies because we have a lot of this seasonality. We also put some COVID episode dummies with the pre-COVID period as a reference group, and then all the dummies referring to the various episodes. We have also municipality category dummies with the center as the reference. And then we have some covariates. So the covariates are here. Well, in fact, we have a very large range of covariates, but we only selected some of them using Lasso. Some covariates that describe the socioeconomic characteristic of each municipality. Some covariates that describe the touristic nature and touristic attractiveness of the municipality, and some covariates that describe the accessibility characteristics of the municipality. And finally, the random terms. So we put a specific trend for each region. We also put interactions between the category of municipality and the period, so to capture differentiated trends for each category of municipality, depending on whether you are in the center, in a ring, etc. Then the evolution during the COVID-19 pandemic was not the same, so we put an interaction to capture that, and some an autoregressive process to capture also the inertia over time. And we estimated that model for monthly for all municipalities in hexagonal France, and for 3 dependent variables. So here you have the descriptive stats for the total number of listings in each municipality, but we have the same for the average occupation rate and the average daily rate. So we have lots and lots of results. I'm only showing you some of them, but just to illustrate to you this idea that we have some different dynamics depending on versus you are professional or non-professional with this kind of supply versus price adjustment. So here for the total number of listing, we can see the impact of the first lockdown. You had 10% listings less during the first lockdown, 17.8% less during the first easing. And if you compare the last 2 columns between the professional listings and the non-professional listings, what you can see is that everything else being equal, there is much less decrease with respect to the pre-COVID period for professionals than for non-professionals. And this is really because what I was saying earlier, it might be costly for professionals to remove their listings out of the market that for non-professionals. So you have decrease, of course, but much less than for non-professionals. This also translates in occupation rates. So again, you have the impact of the first lockdown that was very strong on occupation rate, minus 100% with respect to the pre-COVID period. And again, yeah, maybe this table is more interesting. In terms of the average daily rates, what I was saying to you, that the professionals had more of a price adjustment strategy, which would mean that they would do some intertemporal price discrimination. And you really can see that when you look at the decrease in the average daily rates during the COVID-19 pandemic, where the decrease was much stronger in the average daily rates that were asked for professionals than for non-professionals. At the end of the pandemic, you more or less have convergence, but during the pandemic, there was really much more price decrease for professionals than for non-professionals. So they wanted to adapt more quickly in terms of prices because you had all this budgetary constraints. I mean that it's costly for them to remove their listings out of the market, whereas for non-professionals who just share, you know, a house backyard, you know, you just put it out and that's the end of the story. We also have, of course, lots of results with respect to the impact of the characteristics. So we mostly have the expected results in the sense that, for instance, natural amenities play an important role. Of course, if you have better annual temperature, less raining days, then you have more listings, and so on and so forth. So what we can see in this large-scale analysis that we made, and we have lots of other results, is that we had this very sharp increase of short-term rentals during the pandemic. You had a stronger effects during the first lockdown, and you have very spatially differentiated effects depending on the category of municipality you're in. So I didn't detail that, but what we show is that the central municipalities and main poles were more affected by the various restrictions to limit the spread of COVID-19 rather than the municipalities that are in Couronne or non-attractive areas. And yes, we had this expected impact on the spatial supply. Maybe I'll skip the Zoom on Paris just to let you know. And again, if you're interested, you can send Marie Breuillet and myself an email to have the paper. We make a Zoom on Paris to see how the main spatial clusters of Airbnb listings evolved during the COVID-19 pandemic. And to do that, we made some exploratory spatial data analysis with global and local spatial autocorrelation statistics. So probably most of you are pretty much aware with that. So maybe I'll just show you a graph here. So the first row here shows the spatial clusters of the total number of listings in Paris during the pandemic. Here we are at the IRIS level, so it's a very small scale analysis. So what we see is that in terms of the total number of listings, we had basically the same spatial clusters that remained throughout all the period. So we did not have a very strong decrease of the attractiveness of the city center, the most touristic areas of Paris. But we had some things happening in terms of the occupancy rate during the first lockdown. For instance, the occupation rate decreased. So we had a disappearance more or less of all the high spatial clusters. but they reappeared again at the end of the period. So what this means in terms of the Parisian urban structure is that the city center and the most touristic areas are still very strong. And we have lots of other results, but I'll skip that. Just to tell you 2 words, and maybe I'll stop that. If you want some, just make a pause if you have questions on this. Yeah, so exactly, it does not seem to have any long time in terms of structuring effects in the way the spatial distribution of this supply is. So you have some differences depending on the type of host, but you don't have a major breaks. That's exactly this exactly the conclusion here. You don't have any major break, so it's not business as usual, but almost. So we don't have the world before and the world after. It's mainly business as usual, and also in terms of in terms of how these spatial distributions look like exactly. Yeah, maybe I'll talk about that. I'll answer to you, Sébastien, just when I finish the small part on price capitalization. Okay. So as the economists are, of course, very interested in knowing how the Airbnb hosts make their pricing strategies, and you have lots of papers that apply, hedonic modeling, typically including the listing attributes, and they use OLS, GWR, geographically weighted regression to investigate the determinants of pricing. So what this literature shows is that, as is the case for housing and rents, location is important. So the distances to amenities and the distances to the points of interest. But you also have some specificities of short-term rentals that are important to take into account. So these papers would include covariates that capture, for example, the reputation. Is the host a superhost? What is the number of reviews? What is the average star rating? Do we have photos and things like that? There are some papers that try to look at patterns of spatial price mimicking, and whether in terms of prices there is complementarity or substituality to traditional touristic supply. Here you have a short literature review of everything that has been done so far in this hedonic price literature applied to Airbnb listings. So of course you have the listings attributes, that's structural characteristics, so that's very usual. You have the listing location also, that's very usual, but here you have the very specific characteristics and covariates that are part of these models, the host attributes, the reputation, the rental policies. My take, and this also allows me to answer your question, Sébastien, is that the major caveat of this kind of literature that is almost already quite extensive, but I'm sure that there will be a lot of other papers that will be published on that, is that they basically estimate what I would call naive hedonic regressions. That is, you don't have any strong identification strategy that allows to have causal interpretations. It's only correlations. Well, correlations are interesting, and correlations, it's basically what I presented you earlier. I presented correlations, not causations. But I think that in order to push a little bit the literature forward, we really will need to have strong identification strategies, to rely on quasi-experiments, or to rely on other strategies to be able to say what is the causal impact, for instance, of the reputation of host on the price. And with respect to GWR, of course, it's an interesting method to look at spatial heterogeneity of the spatial variability of the coefficients, and to see that there is spatial variability in the way a determinant impacts the price or something else. But then, of course, if you want to have a more causal interpretation of that, you need to link GWR with some identification strategy. I'm switching now to economic impact. So I just have a question. The links between short-term rentals and hotels, I'm just talking about it in the first part of the economic impact. So I'm just we'll look at that just a little bit later. In our application, we just put a global variable that captures the supply of traditional touristic accommodation, but we didn't go further than that in our application. But absolutely, it should be of interest to look at that a little bit more closely, and in particular, if we want to have a causal interpretation of this coefficient, then we should think about some identification strategy that allows us to go a little bit beyond correlation. Just turning to economic impacts, well, there are three groups of papers, and they depend on what kind of market they look at. So typically, the rental rate market has a term structure. So the hotels occupy the short end of the rental rate structure. Then you have typically the weekly furnished housing, and then you have the rental housing for the long end. So home accommodation, short-term rentals, they target the short end of the rental rate term. So you have a first group of papers that look at the effects on the incumbent, so typically the hotel sector, and see whether there is complementarity or substitution between short-term rentals and hotels. And basically, if short end and long end market in rental market was completely segmented, then the story would end here. So what we would talk about would be, okay, is there complementarity, or if there's or is there competition, substitution between short-term rentals and hotels? But the story does not end here, because the markets, the housing markets display some kind of porosity. What I was saying earlier, as a homeowner, so depending on the local regulation, of course, but you might have the choice between putting your home on the short-term market or putting it on the traditional long-term market. Okay, and this yields what has been called in the literature a rent gap. Because you have a rent gap, because it might be much more profitable to put your home on the short-term rental market, and if you're allowed to do so, and you're more or less allowed to do so depending on the local regulations, because you can do it, then there are also effects on the property market. So because it basically decreases supply and other mechanisms, transmission mechanisms. So, and this is the second part of what I will be talking about. And because you have effects on the property market, of course, then you have effects on the whole spatial organization of the city. It impacts the whole urban fabric. With all these issues of gentrification and what has been also called more recently touristification. So the whole transformation of areas within the city, that places that completely transform to be totally dedicated to tourism. Okay, but not only the city, also elsewhere, because Airbnb and short-term rentals are such a large-scale phenomenon, as I was trying to explain earlier, it has an impact on the whole regional fabric, okay, not only the urban fabric. Just a few words on the effects on the hotel sectors. Of course, you have this Airbnb narrative that you have a very complementary supply to hotels. However, most empirical analyses find that it is not the case. It really adds up to an existing supply, hotel supply, particularly in touristic areas, so that you have lots of empirical analysis that would find negative impacts on hotel revenue per room, because you have both a reduction in the occupation rate and a reduction in the prices of hotels that try to adjust to this new competition. But all of this means that you have negative, a decreasing hotel revenue when you have a higher density of short-term rentals. And of course, as is everywhere, you have lots of heterogeneity according to time. It's not the same whether you are in summer or in other periods. It depends on the location and depends on the category of hotels. So you have this literature that would seem to point out that the hotels that are mostly subject to competition are the hotels that are lower priced and of lower category, because they really don't offer services that really differentiate themselves from short-term rentals. So here you have a literature review, and I only found one paper that does a more structural welfare analysis. So of course you can buy or not very structural spatial models with a lot of behavioral assumptions of people maximizing things, but at least this allows to do a welfare analysis. And what this paper shows is that if you put on one side of the balance the welfare gains from the consumers and the hosts, and on the other side the welfare losses of the hotels, the total welfare gain has increased. So consumers and hosts gain more, but they are concentrated in locations and times, particularly when hotels are capacity constraints. And to my point of view, of course, if you want to design policies, then that kind of analysis of welfare is really important to perform. In terms of the transmission mechanisms to the housing market, well, of course, you have a decrease of supply because as I was saying, the short-term and the long-term housing markets, rental markets are not segmented. So decrease of supply and facing an increasing demand or makes rents increase. And then with respect to housing prices, you also have a set of mechanisms that are nicely described here that I took from Shepard and Udell. Because it makes a stream of revenues for the hosts, because you have it may increase local amenities, so you have all these mechanisms that make the property prices to rise. And of course, on the other side, you have all these negative externalities of guests, but that would tend to make property prices fall. But overall, what the literature tends to show is that there is mostly an inflationary impact of short-term rentals, and this has impacts on housing affordability and policy. If you look at the literature, you have lots of papers that look at the effects of these short-term rentals on rents and housing prices, again using hedonic models, but only a few. And again, this is something that would really be interesting to upgrade. Only a few have an explicit causal identification strategy, so relying on IV, or relying on regulation changes as quasi-experiments. So you have these papers that look at changes in capping the number of guest days, restricting the number of listings, or the other way around, reducing the bureaucratic procedures, and then they look at the impact on the supply of Airbnb using regression discontinuity, using difference in difference, and things like that. So mostly what these papers find is that, well, there is indeed an inflationary impact on housing prices and rents. So here you have some examples. We did some research of our own, and because time flies, maybe I'll just skip that one, because, well, maybe some of you already know that paper. It's a paper that was published in International Regional Science Review in 2019, where we looked at the impact of Airbnb on the private rental market of 8 cities, which were very different in terms of the way the rental market works and tourist attractiveness. So we had data on both on data on the Airbnb density and data on rents. We estimated a hedonic model adjusting for nonlinearity. And what we found is basically here, so we distinguished between total listings and professional listings, and also restricting the sample of new tenancy agreements. And what we found was a very strong effect, very inflationary effect in Paris, and especially for both total number of listings and professional listings. So we have this particular situation in Paris and in some of the other cities where you have a lot of tension in the housing market. Maybe in one word also, an application that we are currently working on for the whole of France, and to look at the impact of Airbnb on housing prices. What we have here is an identification strategy that is based on instrumental variables, and in particular on ad views from Le Bon Coin, which is a major also platform. Why is that? Because basically our point is to say that what we want to estimate is mainly a supply function. So maybe I'll go just there, and I'll show you if you are interested also later. But basically what we have here is some kind of supply equation where we want to have a causal estimation of the impact of the density of short-term rental listings in each municipality on the price. And as we know, for a long time in econometrics, if we want to causally estimate a supply effect, we need demand shocks and vice versa. So as a demand shock, we will use the number of views of the 3 most viewed ads in the municipality, and the 2-month variation coming from Le Bon Coin. The idea is that it captures the demand, the overall demand, and also the shift in demand, and this is our instrumental variables. These are instruments that are basically credible, because when we make an estimation on the prices in cities that do not have any Airbnb listings, then we find that the instruments have no effects. So this is what we want from an instrument, that it is correlated with the endogenous variable, so density of Airbnb, but not correlated with the outcome. So this shows that it is not correlated with the outcome, and this shows that it is very much correlated with our Airbnb density. So we pretty much are confident with our instrument here. So of course we have also a lot of covariates that describe the municipality, and so on and so forth. And maybe I'll just show you here the first stage regression and our main results. The first stage regression here shows that there is indeed high correlation between the number of views and the growth of the number of views, even if you control for everything else, with the density of listings. So we are pretty much happy with these instruments. And in terms of the main results, what this table shows is that depending on the specification, depending on what we add up in this specification, then a 1% increase in listings density would imply an increase ranging from 5.5% to 10.9% in the per square meter price of real estate in the municipality. So it's quite a significant and high impact of Airbnb listings overall. So that's the average effect for the whole of France. And then we make a lot of heterogeneity analysis showing that the impact is even more important in central places. The impact is even more important in places where you have a lot of secondary housing, so places where you already have a lot of tension on the amount of housing supply, and results like that. So this is really ongoing work that is going to be updated soon, I hope. Okay. And maybe last thing in this part, before I switch, because I've already talked too much, before I switch to conclusion, and then I'll take some questions, and then just a few words of conclusion. Of course, if it has an impact on the overall housing prices, then there is this link to gentrification and touristification, and you have several papers that would tend to show that short-term rentals indeed increase or amplify existing gentrification processes through housing displacement. As I was telling you, if you have to pay more rent, at some point maybe you're not able to do that, and you have to move out. And also commercial and economic shifts with local businesses that adapt to rising prices. So that's the new gentrification battlefront. And touristification is even a more acute transformation of spaces, of that, where all spaces homogenize. You pretty much find the same commerces and things to buy for tourists everywhere, less diversity, and all these problems also linked to over-tourism. And I believe there are several papers here that talk about these issues, which raises, of course, issues linked to sustainability. One question that I find is interesting is the chicken and egg story between Airbnb and gentrification. And there is this recent paper that I found quite interesting that tends to point out that Airbnb both induces and enables gentrification, and there is a set of mechanisms that show you that gentrification, first is the areas that gentrify where it's more profitable to switch to Airbnb because of the rent gap, and then Airbnb increases gentrification, and then more rent gap, and then you have this cumulative thing that arises. And then of course people are not happy with that. So you have in France, for instance, a collective of citizens that went on war against short-term rentals, because in some places it's completely impossible to find affordable housing anymore, and it's really a big issue. And so of course it has prompted a lot of regulatory measures in European cities with high heterogeneity in terms of degree, content of instruments, but I'm not talking about that because that would be the topic of a speech per se. Just to tell you that there are a lot of possible ways to regulate Airbnb. If there are no, just let me see if there are questions. Different questions. No, I don't see new questions.
Yes, Julie, you have a couple of questions in the chat, I guess.
In the chat, so I'm not looking at the good
No.
Okay, so long-term effect, I answered to that. What is the ratio of Airbnb tourist nights per year to hotel and other places were known? Typical price ratio. Yes, yeah, these are interesting numbers that I don't have them like that in my mind, but yes, we'll look into that yeah, that would be indeed very interesting to try to explain what the spatial patterns are, both in Paris and globally. So thank you for this this comment. So at the beginning that they were less affected between them. Yeah, in fact, what we see in the empirical analysis we made is that the professionals, so those that rent more than two places for rent or that rent for a long time, were more affected in the sense that they had to adjust their price more. And this is pretty much what some literature tends also to find about hotels. So the professional owners, the professional hosts, and the hotels pretty much behaved the same during the COVID pandemic, whereas, as I was saying, the non-professional hosts adjusted more like, okay, for the moment, it's not very interesting to put my place on this market, so I'm just removing it or putting it back to the traditional long-term rental market. So it's really supply quantity versus price adjustment, and hotels and professional hosts, yes, really had more to adapt using price adjustment. But can it somehow the other way? That is no, yeah, I completely agree with the comment of Jan. So overall, in fact, what the literature tends to say is that there is more competition than complementarity of Airbnb with hotels, of short-term rentals with hotels, but again, I would say that, of course, there is a lot of heterogeneity, also what the literature tends to show. And that will be my last point of the research agenda, is that I really think that this literature should be upgraded with strong identification strategies that allow to make causal assessment. And for the moment, in hotels versus an Airbnb, I know of only one paper that does that. Maybe there are more. I'm not saying I'm quite extensive, but I would say, okay, the other way around. Most papers do not have a causal identification strategy. So, I mean, we have correlations, and sometimes we have very convincing correlations of, you know, in some places we have competition versus substitutability, but this really calls for more, you know, using quasi-experiments, using all these methods that allow to have more causal assessment. Yeah, apart hotel, okay. Apart hotel, do we have data on apart hotel? But you're quite right, because in fact, apart hotel provide services that are quite similar to Airbnb, where you typically have, at least when you rent a full housing, you have your own kitchen, you have your own and things like that. So it's quite similar to apart hotel. So I agree that would be a specific segment to look at more closely. Yes. But do we have data? I don't know. We need to check if we have specific data on apart hotel. I agree, and that would be a nice control group, in fact, apart hotel. So yeah, thank you for this suggestion. And about regulation, yes, I was very fast on that, but typically it should be place-based. of course, and it is already kind of place-based, because the cities at the beginning were really at the forefront of regulation of the short-term rent, because they were the first that were hit by that. And now what I just said is that the whole territory is hit, but not all territories have the same problematic in terms of housing tension, in terms of touristic tension, in terms of everything. So of course that there should be maybe some large scale. In France, at least, this is what happens. There are some large-scale recommendations, and then there is a lot of space and lot of that is given to municipalities and intergroup municipalities to regulate more closely, depending on the specificities of the territories. And municipalities really want also, it's really something that is in discussion all the time. They really are requesting from the national government more liberty to regulate as they wish. And maybe I'll just make some words of conclusion. So that would be this is really very personal of what could be a research agenda that looks at these issues with a spatial lens. Of course, everything capitalizes in prices. So the housing market is really at the core of everything. So both in terms of how hosts make their price strategy. So as I was saying before, you have all these papers that use some hedonic models to see what are the determinants of Airbnb or short-term rental prices. But I think this is really should be upgraded with some stronger identification strategy to look at, you know, the interactions between the prices of hotels and short-term rentals. Also the link to commercial activities, and also the extent of spatial mimicking. I mean, in what way the hosts look at their neighbors to fix their prices, and for that we need quasi experiments to have a causal assessment of all these things. We need more, in my opinion, also more large-scale analysis. So of course you have all these papers that are very, very interesting, that look very in depth and very thoroughly on one urban area. But in terms of the fact that we find this sharing, this accommodation sharing everywhere, that really calls for more large-scale analysis into how these things are located and how they move over time, you know. So this also should be a topic for regional scientists, you know, that look maybe at regional disparities at a larger scale. But we see that because of these impacts on the housing markets, that this implies mobility at maybe people would move to the next department, to the next region, etc. And we already see that in France, you know, on the littorals. It's almost impossible to find affordable housing in Brittany on the Atlantic littoral anymore, and it's a big crisis. And so what we see is that you have more residential mobility in the areas that are just located behind the littoral fronts, you know. So this means that we have this whole picture pattern to have in mind when we look at these short-term rentals. It's not only local impacts, but it's much broader impacts. Then what I was saying, we have this chicken and egg issue between short-term rental and gentrification, and this is really a literature that is emerging, and I really think that it is an important topic, because of all the, of course, gentrification is a major issue in the urban fabric, because then you have all these socio-spatial segregation issues and, you know, social issues that go with that. So what is the specific impact of Airbnb on gentrification with respect to all the other drivers of gentrification? and how, you know, these two things interact. That is something that is, I think, of major interest in the evolution of the urban fabric. Then as I was saying also, in terms of designing policies, and in particular in designing place-based policies, welfare analysis is important in order to have an idea of who wins, who loses, when, how, you know. So of course, in order to do welfare analysis, you need to go to more structural spatial economic models. And then the two last points are really linked together. I've already pointed that out several times. We really need strong identification strategies to make impact evaluation of these both of these determinants of all, you know, also of these regulations, which means that, you know, of course I would tend to say that we need more causal inference, that is more attention to the causal interpretation of the results, to be able to go beyond correlations. Correlations are, of course, very interesting to see what happens, but then if you want to say something, in particular to help to the design of policies, you need to have strong identification strategies, and of course, if you go to that, if you go for more internal validity, then you have, of course, this traditional trade-off between more internal validity usually means less external validity, so less ability to make some to generalize. But of course, that's a trade-off that is rooted in all this literature about causal inference. But yeah, in my opinion, but again, that's really an opinion of a quantitative economist that has switched to causal inference for the last 10 years. Yeah, I would really say that it is important in this topic, and of course in these other topics. And maybe I'll stop there because. So thank you very much for your attention, and here are some captions I took yesterday on the Airbnb website to show you the variety of goods, housing, and types of housing that you can rent, going from luxury palaces to very specific places. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie, for your insightful presentation. So, I mean, the time is almost over, but we have 5 minutes for last question of discussion. I just see scrolling some comment in the chat if you want to have a look. And of course, we have rooms for a couple of other questions from the public.
You can say that you're not, you do not agree with the research agenda. Maybe I missed things that seem to be important, and you know. So, of course, don't hesitate to contact Marie Bruyère and myself for these topics. We are very open to discussion and comments and remarks and criticism, and you know.
I mean, so taking advantage of being the chair of the sessions, just the questions. You mostly centrally focus your analysis on France. That it's, I mean, I imagine it's because data sources and possibility of having access to that. To which extent you think data or results for France are specific for the French setting? It could be extended to the other. Because one thing I was wondering is that Airbnb, I mean, to what is my knowledge, attracts also a very important part of international travelers, not just national one. And therefore, international travelers maybe they have different kind of expectation, different kind of I would say, demands, let's call it. And so my question is, how much is heterogeneity in the demand with heterogeneity of supply?
Well, first, in terms of the data, most data that we have, as I was saying, comes from RDNA, which scraps data for not only for France but from everywhere else, and I think it's a data source for lots of papers that that work on this topic. And of course, it's maybe. Of course, then you are right. You have heterogeneity, and this is the point I wanted to make, is that you have a lot of heterogeneity in the patterns of supply, and we have lots of results on the heterogeneity that really reacted differently depending on the type of territory, whether you were in a city center, whether you are in a rural area. Of course, this was not the same temporal evolution, the way things reacted during the COVID-19 pandemic, and this is pretty in line with the spatial distribution of professional versus non-professional, and also the shared room with respect to entire apartments. So we have all these interrelationships that happen. And you know, of course, part of the results that we found can be linked to some specific features of France, and then notably in terms of regulations. But I think that some of them really are linked to what has already been found in the literature. So this idea that we have this distinction between price adjustment versus quantity adjustment, this is something that has been found also pretty much elsewhere. So yeah, of course, yeah, well, you're right. When I was saying we need more large-scale analysis, I had in mind a large scale at the level of a country, but probably even a larger scale analysis, and to put that in relationship with the differences in national regulations would be quite interesting to do.
Okay, thank you. There is one last comment in the chat, I guess, and then we can close the session because
yeah, of course.
10:30.
As I was saying, don't hesitate to be in touch.
Okay, thank you very much to all attendees, assistant to the session, to Julie for this very, very, very nice and insightful presentation. And I hope you keep enjoying the conference on site and online today. Okay, so see you and take care. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Merci, Julie, on parle.
Thank you very much, everyone.